The scent of strong coffee and buttered toast hung heavy in the air at the American Dream Diner. Emily, her 42 years showing not in harsh lines, but in the knowing calm of her eyes, instinctively adjusted the iconic sunshine yellow apron that was the diner's trademark. Her hands, their calluses a testament to 2 decades of balancing heavy trays, smoothed the fabric without a conscious thought. Through the polished gleam of the front window, she watched the controlled chaos of the kitchen, the sizzle of burgers on the grill, the whine of milkshake blenders, and the percussive rhythm of plates and silverware, a familiar orchestra that, until recently, had been the soundtrack to her contentment. The small bell over the door chimed, a hopeful sound. Emily turned, her well-practiced smile ready, but it faltered when she saw Mark Thompson, the new regional manager, stride in, his black leather briefcase a stark contrast to the diner's cheerful decor. "Good morning, team," he announced, his voice slicing through the morning bustle. "Meeting in 5 minutes. Everyone present." Emily's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. She caught the eye of Joe, the head cook who'd been there since day one, and saw her own weariness reflected in his gaze. In the cramped back room, redolent with the sharp smell of bleach and old coffee, the staff gathered. Mark, standing before them, unfurled a colorful chart. "Our numbers are below target," he declared, his finger jabbing at a downward-trending red line. "Starting today, new policies go into effect." A knot of dread tightened in Emily's stomach as Mark went through the list. Overtime cuts, smaller portion sizes, and an end to the informal perks for regulars. And most importantly, he emphasized, his sharp gaze sweeping over them, zero tolerance for unauthorized charity. This includes free meals, leftovers, or any form of handout. Understood? A reluctant murmur of agreement filled the room. Emily bit her lip, her thoughts immediately going to Mr. Johnson, the widower who came in every Tuesday and who she always made sure got an extra slice of pie. Back on the dining floor, Emily moved like an automaton, taking orders, smiling, clearing tables, but her mind was elsewhere, her eyes continually drawn to the street outside the window. As the afternoon progressed, the sky grew dark and menacing, the first deep rumble of thunder sounding in the distance. She was wiping down a booth near the window when she first saw them. 2 identical little girls, no older than 5 or 6, standing just outside. Their matted brown hair clung to their pale, thin faces, and their wide, dark eyes were glued to the plates of food inside, tracking every forkful, every bite. Emily froze, the cleaning rag forgotten in her hand. One of the girls pressed a small palm against the window, leaving a faint print, while the other wrapped her arms around her own stomach in a gesture of profound, unspoken hunger. The bell chimed again. Mark emerged from his office, his eyes instantly locking onto the scene outside. His brow furrowed in annoyance as he started towards the door. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. Her body moved before her mind caught up, and in a heartbeat she was positioned between Mark and the exit. "I'll handle this," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. Mark paused, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Remember the new policies, Emily." She gave a stiff nod, feeling his disapproving stare on her back as she stepped outside. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Emily opened the door, the bell jingling softly. The girls flinched back, their eyes a mixture of fear and desperate hope. For a split second, Emily was paralyzed. To her right, oblivious customers enjoyed their meals. To her left, Mark watched with crossed arms, a silent judge. And before her, 2 small children shivered as the rain turned into a merciless downpour. Another crack of thunder, closer this time, seemed to jolt something loose inside her. 20 years of practiced smiles, of yes sir and as you wish, dissolved in an instant. Locking eyes with the girls, she saw a reflection of a younger self, of Joe, of all the people who had found more than just a paycheck, but a sanctuary at the American Dream Diner. Taking a deep breath, her hand found her apron pocket, closing around the reassuring bulk of her rent money. In one swift movement, she turned, blocking Mark's line of sight. "Come in," she whispered to the girls, her smile finally genuine and full of warmth. "Let me tell you a secret about the best apple pie in town. As she led the children inside, Emily was acutely aware she was crossing a dangerous line, but feeling their cold, tiny hands in hers, she knew with absolute certainty that some rules were made to be broken, and some stories were meant to be rewritten. The comforting aroma of cinnamon and warm apples enveloped Emily as she guided the twins to a secluded booth in the corner, her eyes darting towards Mark's office to ensure he remained inside. "Here," she whispered, indicating the semi-private space. "Sit down." The girls obeyed without a word, their movements so synchronized they seemed like a single entity. Now that they were closer, Emily could see the details the window had obscured. Their dresses, once bright, were now faded and carefully patched, and their worn-out shoes were held together with makeshift string laces. "I'm Emily," she said, kneeling to be at their eye level. "And you are?" The twin with a tiny birthmark by her lip answered, her voice a fragile whisper. "I'm Lily." "Daisy," murmured the other, her fingers twisting with her sister's beneath the table. Emily saw their slender wrists and the hollows in their cheeks, their bright eyes shadowed by dark circles that seemed too heavy for such small children. "Well, Lily and Daisy," Emily smiled, her heart aching. "How about a special meal on the house?" Before they could even respond, she hurried towards the kitchen. Joe raised a questioning eyebrow as she slipped inside furtively. "I need 2 full plates," Emily whispered, "and make it look like it's for table 5. Joe hesitated only a moment, his expression shifting to one of quiet understanding. He nodded once and turned to the grill without a word. Minutes later, Emily carefully balanced a tray holding 2 steaming plates of eggs, bacon, and pancakes, each with a generous slice of apple pie. She placed the feast before the twins, whose eyes widened in a breathtaking mix of wonder and gratitude. "Eat," she encouraged gently. "We have time." The girls needed no further coaxing. They ate with a speed that was both heartbreaking and strangely neat, a silent, desperate efficiency, as if they feared the food might disappear if they made a sound. Emily kept herself busy at nearby tables, constantly glancing at Mark's office door. With every passing minute, her pulse quickened. She was shattering every new rule, yet she felt a profound sense of rightness, not regret. It was Lily who asked, her mouth still full of pie, "Why are you being so nice to us?" The question startled Emily. She moved closer, pretending to clear their plates. "Because everyone deserves a little kindness," she replied softly. Daisy, after swallowing a bite of pancake, added, "Mommy used to say that." "She did?" Emily couldn't help but ask. "Before she went to heaven," Lily explained, her small voice trembling. Emily's heart sank. "Orphans." That explained so much. She was about to ask another question when a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision made her freeze. Mark? He was standing in his office doorway, phone held up, clearly recording the entire scene. The blood turned to ice in her veins. Instinctively, she moved to shield the girls, as if her body alone could protect them from his cold judgment. "Emily," Mark's voice cut through the diner's hum like a shard of glass. "My office. Now." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Customers stopped eating, servers paused mid-stride. The only sound was the distant clatter of a pan in the kitchen. Giving the twins one last reassuring glance, Emily followed him. The office door had barely clicked shut before he erupted. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Emily straightened her back. "Helping hungry children." Mark let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "You're stealing. Stealing from the company. Stealing from me." "They're just kids, Mark. Orphans. How can we—" "I don't care if they're orphans or princesses," Mark interrupted, his face flushed with rage. "We have policies, rules, and you deliberately broke them." A wave of righteous anger surged through Emily. Some rules need to be broken when— "No," Mark cut her off again, his voice dropping to a dangerously low tone. "You don't decide which rules to follow. I decide, and I've decided you're fired." The world tilted beneath Emily's feet. Fired? After 20 years? Mark offered a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. Exactly, and I have it all on video as proof. Before she could fully absorb the shock, Mark threw open the office door and pushed her out into the dining room. "Attention, everyone," his voice boomed. This employee was caught stealing food and giving it away to strangers. She no longer represents the American Dream Diner. "Emily, hand over your badge and leave immediately." The ensuing silence was crushing. Dazed, Emily looked around at the shocked faces of her coworkers and the confused eyes of the customers. Then her gaze found Lily and Daisy. The twins stood trembling, their eyes wide with terror. Before Emily could utter a word, they darted towards the door and vanished into the rainy street. "No!" Emily cried, starting after them, but Mark grabbed her arm. "Your badge?" he demanded. With shaking hands, Emily unpinned the badge she had worn with pride for 2 decades. Handing it over felt like surrendering a part of her soul. That's when the uproar began. "This is outrageous!" an elderly customer shouted, standing up. "She was helping children!" exclaimed another. Soon, the entire diner was in turmoil, with customers yelling, employees murmuring, and some even throwing their own badges onto the floor in a show of solidarity. But Emily barely heard the chaos. Her focus was on the door through which Lily and Daisy had fled. They were out there, alone in the rain, and she felt it was her fault. As she walked towards the exit, ignoring Mark's shouts and the customers' pleas, the full weight of her decision crashed down on her. She had lost her job, her livelihood, but the deepest pain came from the fear that in trying to help, she had only brought more harm to 2 vulnerable children. The cold rain met her outside, mingling with the tears that now flowed freely down her cheeks. She frantically scanned the street, desperate for a glimpse of the twins. But they were gone, swallowed by the unforgiving city. With a heavy heart and a future shrouded in uncertainty, Emily took one last look at the American Dream Diner. 20 years of her life gone in a single moment, all for one act of kindness. As she walked away, a single question echoed in her mind. Was it worth it? The answer, she knew, was in the memory of 2 hungry girls' grateful eyes, and that was something no one could ever take away from her. The black Bentley moved like a shadow down the rain-slicked street, pulling to a silent stop in front of the American Dream Diner. George Miller, at 70 years old, observed the familiar storefront through the steamed-up window. The once vibrant sign looked tired and washed out under the bleak gray sky. With a sigh, George adjusted his silk tie and stepped from the car, his bespoke Italian shoes making a soft sound on the wet pavement. His driver, James, hurried to open an umbrella over him, but George waved him away. "No need, James. I won't melt." As he approached the entrance, George felt every one of his 70 years. His hair, once a deep brown, was now a distinguished silver, and the lines on his face were a silent testament to decades of hard choices and long nights. He paused, peering through the front window, and a flood of memories washed over him. It was 1975 when he, a young immigrant with big dreams and empty pockets, first opened the doors to this very diner. The smell of strong coffee, the clatter of dishware, the warm chatter of regulars. It was more than a business. It was his American dream made real. Shaking his head, George returned to the present. Something felt wrong. The welcoming spirit he had painstakingly cultivated seemed to have vanished. Stepping inside, the familiar bell chimed, but the atmosphere was tense. Employees moved with a robotic efficiency, their smiles strained. Customers ate in a strange, subdued silence. Then he heard it, a loud, angry voice emanating from the back. "No longer represents the American Dream Diner. Emily, hand over your badge and leave immediately." George frowned, moving discreetly towards the source of the commotion. He saw a middle-aged woman, her eyes filled with tears, handing her name badge to a man in a suit he didn't recognize. The room then erupted in protest, customers shouting, staff murmuring their dissent. George stood stunned as the woman, Emily he presumed, walked out with a look of utter defeat. "What on earth is happening here?" George muttered under his breath. Before he could step in, the door burst open and two small, identical girls ran out, nearly colliding with him. For a fleeting moment, George's eyes met theirs. He saw fear, yes, but also a flash of something else. Determination, maybe hope. He wasn't sure, but the look resonated with him. The twins disappeared into the rain, with Emily following close behind. George was torn between investigating the chaos inside and following the drama outside. He chose the former. Squaring his shoulders, he walked directly to the man in the suit, who was now attempting to placate the angry diners. "Excuse me," George said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority. The man turned, his face a mask of annoyance. "Look, sir, we're dealing with an internal situation here. If you could please go back to your—" "I'm afraid I cannot do that," George interrupted softly. "You see, I'm George Miller, the founder of this chain." The color drained from the man's face. "Mr. Miller, we weren't expecting—" "Clearly," George replied coolly. "And you are?" Mark Thompson, regional manager." George nodded slowly. "Well, Mr. Thompson, it seems we have much to discuss. Your office. And please." As he followed Mark, George noted the hopeful glances from the remaining staff. What had been done to his diner? Inside the cramped office, George remained standing, a commanding presence. "Explain yourself," he ordered. Mark swallowed hard. "Mr. Miller, I was just following protocol. That employee, Emily, was caught giving away free food to vagrants. It's against company policy." George raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Vagrants? You mean those two little girls?" "Well, yes. They weren't customers, and how much did that meal cost the company?" George interjected. Mark blinked, thrown off. Well, not much. But the principal?" "The principal," George repeated, his voice laced with disappointment. "Let me tell you a principle, Mr. Thompson. When I opened this diner, I was a young immigrant with barely a penny to my name. Do you know who gave me my first decent meal in weeks? The owner of a small cafe. She didn't know me, didn't know if I could pay. She just saw someone who was hungry and acted with compassion." Mark stood silent, a mix of shame and confusion on his face. George continued. "That simple act of kindness inspired me. I vowed that if I ever had a place of my own, I would never deny a meal to someone truly in need. That, Mr. Thompson, is the principle on which the American Dream Diner was founded." Turning to the window, George stared out at the rain. "What happened to Emily?" She was fired, sir." George closed his eyes, a deep sadness settling over him. "How long has she worked here?" 20 years, sir." The silence that followed was heavy and profound. Finally, George turned, his gaze piercing. "Do you have a family, Mr. Thompson?" Mark, caught off guard, stammered, Yes, a wife and 2 kids. And if they were out there, hungry, wouldn't you want someone to show them a little compassion?" Mark lowered his head, unable to meet George's stare. "I'll be staying in town for a few days," George announced. "I want a full investigation into this incident, and I want Emily reinstated by the end of the week." "But, sir, corporate policies—" "Policies," George interrupted firmly, "can be changed. Compassion, Mr. Thompson, is non-negotiable." With that, George headed for the door, but paused before leaving. "Oh, and one more thing. Those 2 girls. I want to know everything about them. Their story, their situation, everything." Mark nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Right away." As George left the office, the murmur in the dining room ceased. Every eye was on him, filled with a mixture of curiosity and hope. He paused, looking around at the place that was once his pride and joy, now just a shadow of its former self. But not for long. "James," he called, and his driver instantly appeared. "Clear my schedule for the next week. It seems we have work to do here." Walking back to his car, George couldn't shake the image of those 2 little girls. There was something about them, something familiar he couldn't quite place. And their eyes? One thing was certain. George Miller wouldn't rest until he uncovered the truth behind the incident, and in doing so, perhaps he could find the soul of his beloved American Dream Diner once more. The rain had softened to a fine drizzle by the time George left the American Dream Diner. His still sharp eyes surveyed the street, and that's when he saw them. Two small figures huddled together under the awning of a closed shop a short distance away. For a moment, George hesitated. Decades in the corporate world had taught him to maintain a professional distance, but something about these children pulled at him, an invisible thread of connection. "James," he said softly, "wait in the car." Ignoring his driver's concerned look, George walked slowly towards the girls. They saw him approach and immediately stiffened, like two startled fawns. "Hello," he said, his voice gentle as he stopped at a respectful distance. "It's a bit cold out here, isn't it?" The twins exchanged a quick, silent glance. Finally, the one on the left, Lily, he recalled, spoke up. "Are you the owner of the diner?" George managed a kind smile. "I was, a long time ago. Now I'm just an old man who's curious. May I sit with you?" After another nonverbal consultation, Daisy gave a shy nod. George settled onto the concrete step, letting out a theatrical groan. "Ah, these knees aren't what they used to be. And you two, what are you doing out here by yourselves?" "We were hungry," Lily replied, her voice barely a whisper. "The nice lady gave us food, but then—" She trailed off, her eyes welling up with tears. Daisy finished the thought. The mean man yelled at her. It was our fault. George felt his heart constrict. "No, sweetheart, it wasn't your fault. Sometimes adults do foolish things." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "Do you live nearby?" The girls exchanged another look, clearly weighing how much to trust him. "Not too far," Lily finally said. "But Daddy isn't home right now." "He's looking for work," Daisy added quickly. George nodded in understanding. "And your mother?" The silence that followed was heavy and profound. Daisy looked down at her lap while Lily wrapped a protective arm around her sister. "Mommy went to heaven," Lily said quietly. 2 years ago. George closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of the children's loss. When he opened them, the girls were watching him intently. "I'm so sorry to hear that," he said with genuine sincerity. "It must be hard for you and your father." Daisy nodded. "Daddy works a lot. Sometimes we don't see him for days." "But Aunt Lisa takes care of us," Lily added, as if worried they had said too much. George's interest was piqued. "Aunt Lisa? Does she live with you?" "No," Daisy answered. "She's a teacher. She visits when she can." George processed this new information, his mind already working. "Is she your father's sister or your mother's?" "Mommy's," Lily said. "She looks a lot like her." Something about that phrase struck a chord with George. There was a nagging familiarity in the girls' faces, something he couldn't quite grasp. He pushed the thought aside for the moment. "Well," he said, rising slowly, "it's getting late. You should go home." The twins looked at each other, hesitating. We don't want to bother Aunt Lisa," Daisy murmured. "She already does so much for us." A wave of protectiveness washed over George. These children, so young, were already carrying such heavy burdens. "Listen," he said, crouching to meet their eyes again. "How about this? I have a car right over there. I can give you a ride home. And tomorrow, what if you come back to the diner? I promise, no one will yell at you. In fact, I bet you'll find a nice surprise." The girls regarded him with a mixture of hope and caution. "How do we know we can trust you?" Lily asked, her voice surprisingly firm for her age. George smiled, impressed by her spirit. He slowly reached for his wallet and pulled out a gold business card. "This has my name and number. If anything goes wrong, ask an adult to call me, day or night." Daisy took the card, her eyes widening at the elegant script. "You're really the owner of all the diners?" she asked in awe. George gave a conspiratorial wink. "That'll be our little secret, okay? Now, shall we get you home?" A few minutes later, the Bentley was gliding through the city streets. In the rearview mirror, George watched the twins marvel at the plush interior. "Turn left here, please," Lily instructed shyly. They finally arrived at Maplewood Apartments, a modest building that looked like it had seen better days. George felt a lump form in his throat. "This is it," Daisy announced. Before they got out, George turned to them. "Remember, tomorrow at the diner. I promise, it'll be different." The girls nodded, small smiles touching their lips. As he watched them disappear into the building, a powerful sense of determination grew within him. He would help these children no matter what it took. "Back to the hotel, sir?" James asked. "No," George replied, his eyes still fixed on the building. "To the office. We have work to do." As the car pulled away, George couldn't shake the image of the twins. There was something about them, a spark of resilience that reminded him of someone. But who? Shaking his head, he focused on the immediate task. First, he would ensure these children were safe and fed. Then, he would dig deeper. And maybe, just maybe, he would discover the source of the powerful connection he felt to two little strangers in a city he thought he had left behind, forever. George's office was silent except for the low hum of his computer and the soft clink of ice in his glass of whiskey. The city lights twinkled outside, but sleep was a distant prospect. His mind, tired yet sharp, was consumed with two names, Lily and Daisy Miller. There was something about them, a faint echo from a past he had long since buried. Leaning back in his leather chair, George closed his eyes and was instantly transported back 40 years. The American Dream Diner was just a small, hopeful place, smelling of fresh coffee and possibility. A 30-year-old George wiped down the counter, his white apron still pristine. The bell over the door chimed. "Welcome to the American Dream Diner," he said, looking up. His heart skipped a beat. Standing in the doorway, framed by the morning light, was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Her brown hair fell in soft waves, and her deep eyes seemed to hold entire galaxies. "Hello," she smiled shyly. "I saw the sign in the window." "Are you hiring?" George stammered for a moment. Yes, I'm George. The owner?" "Elizabeth," she replied, extending her hand. "Nice to meet you, George." A notification sound from his computer snapped George back to the present. He blinked, refocusing on the screen. It was an email from his assistant. "Mr. Miller, I've found information on Elisa Miller. She's a teacher at Lincoln Elementary School. Address and contact details attached." A surge of anticipation went through him. Lisa, the girl's aunt. Perhaps she held the key. Without a moment's hesitation, he picked up the phone. The next morning, George found himself in a small coffee shop near Lisa's school, his heart pounding with an intensity he hadn't felt in decades. The door opened, and a woman in her early 40s walked in. George felt the air leave his lungs. It was like seeing a ghost. Lisa was the spitting image of Elizabeth, just a few decades older. The same deep eyes, the same gentle smile. "Mr. Miller?" she asked, approaching his table. George stood, extending a hand. "Yes. Thank you for coming, Ms. Miller." They sat, a tense silence hanging between them. "So," Lisa began, "you wanted to talk about Lily and Daisy?" George nodded, trying to marshal his thoughts. "Yes, I met them yesterday at my diner." Lisa frowned. "They mentioned something about a diner and a kind woman, but I didn't understand exactly what happened." George briefly explained the incident, watching as concern etched itself onto Lisa's face. "Are they all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. Yes, George reassured her. "I'm more concerned about their general situation. They mentioned their father being unemployed." Lisa let out a long, weary sigh. "David has been struggling ever since Susan, ever since my sister passed away. He tries, but it's not easy." George felt a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry for your loss," Lisa offered a sad smile. "Thank you. Susan was special, just like our mother." Something in that sentence made George freeze. "Your mother?" Yes, Lisa answered, a nostalgic light in her eyes. Elizabeth. She raised us on her own. She was the strongest woman I ever knew. The name echoed in George's mind like a long-lost song, bringing with it a torrent of memories. With a trembling hand, he reached for his wallet. From a hidden flap, he pulled out a faded, yellowed photograph. In it, a young George stood smiling beside a beautiful brown-haired woman. Is this, he hesitated, showing the photo to Lisa. Is this your mother? Lisa's eyes widened. She took the photograph reverently, her fingers tracing the image of Elizabeth's face. Yes, she whispered. But how? Why do you have a photo of her? George felt the weight of decades of secrets and regrets pressing down on him. Elizabeth. She worked for me at the very beginning of the diner. She was everything. Lisa looked from the photo to George, a slow, dawning realization in her eyes. You're him, the man my mother used to talk about. George swallowed hard. What did she say? That there was a man once, someone she loved deeply, but circumstances drove them apart. Lisa paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. She left town pregnant with Susan. The world around George seemed to dissolve. Susan, the twins' mother. My God, he murmured, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The girls? They're your granddaughters, Lisa finished, her voice a mixture of shock and wonder. George sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the revelation. Long-buried memories rushed to the surface. Elizabeth's smile, their shared dreams, the bitter argument that had torn them apart. And now, decades later, fate had intervened, connecting him to a family he never knew he had. Lisa, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I need to make this right. For Elizabeth, for Susan, for the girls. Lisa studied him for a long moment, as if judging the sincerity of his words. Finally, she nodded. We have a lot to discuss, Mr. Miller, she said gently, and many decisions to make. George agreed, a new sense of purpose mixing with his fear and hope. The past he thought he had escaped had returned, not as a ghost to haunt him, but as a chance for redemption. He and Lisa began to unravel the tangled threads of their shared history, and George knew with certainty that his life and the lives of Lily and Daisy would never be the same. The coffee sat untouched, growing cold on the table between George and Lisa. The background noise of the cafe faded into a distant hum, as if the two of them were in a private bubble where time had stopped. Tell me about her, George asked, his voice barely a whisper. About Elizabeth after she left. Lisa took a deep breath, her gaze still on the old photograph. Mom was strong, incredibly strong. She arrived in our small town, pregnant and all alone, but with this fierce look of determination in her eyes. A stab of guilt pierced George's heart. She never mentioned the father? Not directly, Lisa replied, meeting George's eyes. But sometimes, late at night, I'd catch her looking into an old box of keepsakes. There was sadness in her eyes, but there was also love. George closed his eyes, the memories rushing back. The American Dream Diner was taking off, and an excited George, swept up in the success, talked animatedly about expansion. Think about it, Elizabeth, a chain of diners all over the country. Elizabeth had smiled, but her eyes held a trace of concern. George, what about our community here? The people who depend on us? They'll understand, George had argued. We're creating opportunities. At what cost? Elizabeth had asked softly. We're losing our essence, George, the very thing that made us special. The argument escalated, harsh words were exchanged, and the next morning Elizabeth was gone. Mr. Miller? Lisa's voice pulled him from the painful memory. Are you all right? George blinked, realizing tears had welled in his eyes. Forgive me, he murmured, wiping them away. Please go on. Susan? She was the light of Mom's life, Lisa continued, a sad smile on her lips. Susan grew up hearing these magical stories about a place called the American Dream Diner, where everyone was welcome and no one ever left hungry. George felt his heart clench. So Elizabeth had remembered him as a lost dream. Susan was always curious, Lisa went on, always asking about her father, about Mom's past. But Elizabeth, she kept those secrets locked away. And then Susan met David. The twins' father? George asked gently. Lisa nodded. Yes, it was a whirlwind romance. They married young, and soon after, the twins came along, Lily and Daisy. She paused, her voice trembling slightly. Mom was so happy, but also worried, almost as if she knew she wouldn't be around to see the girls grow up. George frowned. What happened to Elizabeth? Cancer, Lisa whispered. It was fast. Susan was 6 months pregnant with the twins when Mom was diagnosed. She passed away before the girls turned 1. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken grief and missed chances. And Susan? George finally asked, dreading the answer. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. A car accident 2 years ago. David was driving. He survived, but the guilt, it's eating him alive. George felt the room spin. So much loss, so many lives altered by a chain of events that, in some way, all led back to that one fateful argument 35 years ago. The twins, he said, his voice raw with emotion. They're my granddaughters. Yes, Lisa confirmed, watching him closely. The full weight of that statement hit George like a physical force. Granddaughters. He had always assumed his line ended with him. But now, suddenly, he was connected to 2 little girls who carried not only his blood, but Elizabeth's. My God, he muttered, running a hand through his silver hair. All these years, all this lost time. Lisa placed a gentle hand on his arm. Mr. Miller, no one could have predicted this. Fate works in strange ways. George nodded slowly, trying to process it all. Then a new resolve ignited in his eyes. Lisa, he said, straightening in his chair, I've made many mistakes in my past, mistakes that cost Elizabeth, Susan, and now Lily, and Daisy. I can't change the past, but, he paused, searching for the right words. I need to do something. I need to help. Lisa studied him for a long moment. What exactly do you have in mind, Mr. Miller? First, he began. The plan's already forming. We need to ensure David and the girls have stability. A job for him, support for the children. And then, he hesitated, unsure how his next words would be received. I'd like to get to know them. Really know them. Be a part of their lives, if they'll let me. Lisa took a deep breath, considering his offer. Mr. Miller, I appreciate your intentions, but please understand, this family has been through a lot. The girls barely remember their mother, and David, he's struggling. We need to go slow. George nodded, acknowledging her caution. Of course. Of course. We'll do it at your pace. But please, let me help. It's the least I can do. For Elizabeth. For her memory. A small smile touched Lisa's lips. You know, Mom always said that the true heart of the American Dream Diner wasn't the food, but the love and compassion behind it. Maybe that's the legacy we can honor together. George felt a surge of emotion. Thank you, Lisa, for giving me this chance. As they began to discuss the next steps, George couldn't help but think of Elizabeth. Somewhere, he hoped, she was smiling, knowing her family was finally coming together. And though the road ahead was uncertain and bound to be filled with challenges, George was determined to make things right. This time, for Elizabeth, for Susan, and above all, for Lily and Daisy. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Sunset Memorial Cemetery as George walked slowly between the headstones, his heart heavy with the weight of decades of unspoken regrets. He finally stopped before a simple granite marker, Elizabeth Miller, 1955-2019. Beloved mother and grandmother. Love is the true measure of a life. George felt his legs grow weak, and he slowly knelt on the soft grass, his fingers tracing the letters carved into the cold stone. "Oh, Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice cracking. How did we end up like this? Closing his eyes, he let the memories flood in. The American Dream Diner was just a dream, scribbled on napkins and discussed over late-night coffee. George, brimming with ambition, could barely contain his excitement. "Think of it, Elizabeth," he'd exclaim, waving his arms in their tiny apartment. "A place where everyone is welcome, where a meal isn't just food, but an act of communion." Elizabeth would smile, her eyes shining with the same passion. "It's beautiful, George, but how are we going to make it happen?" George took her hands in his. "Together, you and me, we can change the world, one plate at a time." Opening day. The small diner gleamed, every surface polished to reflect their hopes. Wearing a brand-new apron, Elizabeth placed a freshly baked apple pie on the counter. "For good luck," she'd said with a grin. George pulled her into a tight hug. "We don't need luck, we have each other." The bell above the door chimed, announcing their very first customer. "Welcome to the American Dream Diner," they said in unison, their faces glowing with pride. Success came quickly. The diner became the heart of the community, and George and Elizabeth worked side by side, turning customers into family. One night after closing, George found Elizabeth at a table, poring over the books. "What's wrong?" he asked, seeing the worry in her expression. She sighed. "George, we're growing so fast. I'm worried we'll lose what makes this place special." He sat beside her, taking her hand. "Never. What we have here is magic, Elizabeth. Imagine if we could share this with more people." She smiled, but a hint of doubt remained. "Maybe, but promise me we'll never forget why we started." "I promise," George said, sealing the vow with a kiss. The fateful argument. George, intoxicated by success, spoke of franchises and national expansion. "We could have a diner in every city," he exclaimed, his eyes bright with ambition. Elizabeth, however, was hesitant. "But what about the people here? Our community?" "They'll understand," he argued. "We're creating opportunities." "But at what cost?" she retorted, her voice trembling. "We're losing our soul, George, the very thing that makes us unique." The words grew heated. Accusations were hurled. "You've changed," Elizabeth said, tears in her eyes. "You're not the man I fell in love with." "And you're holding me back," George shouted, words he would regret for the rest of his life. The next morning, she was gone. No note, no explanation, just an empty space where she used to be. George opened his eyes, the present rushing back in. Silent tears streamed down his wrinkled cheeks. "I was a fool, Elizabeth," he murmured to the headstone. "You were right. I lost my way. I forgot what really mattered." He pulled out the old photograph, the same one he'd shown Lisa. In it, a young George and Elizabeth beamed with hope in front of their new diner. "I searched for you, you know," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But you vanished. And I buried myself in work, trying to fill the void you left." He traced her face in the photo. If I'd known you were pregnant, oh, Elizabeth, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of a nearby tree, and for a moment George could almost hear her laughter. "I built an empire," he reflected bitterly, "but I lost what truly mattered. Family, love, the real essence of our dream." Slowly, George stood, his knees protesting. He took one last look at the headstone, a new determination solidifying within him. "I can't change the past, my love," he said softly. "But I promise you, here and now, that I will do everything in my power to take care of our family. Lily, Daisy, David, they'll have all the support and love I can offer." He took a deep breath, feeling a great weight lifting from his shoulders. "And the American Dream Diner. I'll bring it back to its roots, to our original values. It will be a place of community, compassion, and love once more. Your legacy will live on, Elizabeth. I promise." Carefully, George placed a small bouquet of daisies, her favorite, at the base of the headstone. Beside them, he left the old photograph. "Until we meet again, my love," he whispered, touching the stone one last time. As he walked away, George felt a mixture of profound sadness and renewed resolve. The past could not be changed, but the future was a blank page. And he would do everything in his power to honor Elizabeth's memory and mend the mistakes of the past. With firm steps, he left the cemetery, his mind already racing with plans. There was so much to do: help David find a job, secure a bright future for the twins, revitalize the diner. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. George couldn't help a small, gentle smile. It was as if Elizabeth was sending a sign, approving his plans and offering her silent forgiveness. "Thank you, Elizabeth," he murmured to the twilight sky, "for everything." And with that, George Miller embarked on the most important journey of his life, to redeem the past and build a future worthy of the love he and Elizabeth once shared. The elevator at Maplewood Apartments groaned as it slowly ascended to the 5th floor. George Miller adjusted his collar, feeling conspicuous in his expensive suit in the rundown building. The air was thick with the smells of stale cooking and dampness. Stepping into the dimly lit hallway, he hesitated. The number 507 was on the door ahead, its paint peeling. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. Shuffling footsteps and excited children's whispers came from the other side. The door opened to reveal David Miller, a man who looked like he'd aged a decade since the last photo George had seen. Deep shadows lay under his eyes, and his shoulders were hunched with an invisible weight. "Mr. Miller?" George asked softly. "I'm George Miller. May I come in?" David frowned, confusion plain on his tired face. "Miller? The guy who owns that diner?" Before George could answer, two small heads peeked out from behind David's legs. "It's the man with the nice car," Lily exclaimed, her face lighting up. Daisy just gave a shy wave. David glanced from his daughters to George, suspicion clouding his features. "What do they mean? What do you want?" George felt the chasm of decades of secrets between them. "Mr. Miller. David. I know this is unexpected, but I have important information about your mother-in-law, Elizabeth." The name seemed to hang in the air. For a moment, David stood frozen. Then he reluctantly opened the door wider. "Come in," he mumbled. The apartment's interior was a stark portrait of their struggles. A single room served as living, dining, and kitchen space. A worn-out couch was clearly also a bed. A neat stack of well-loved toys sat in one corner. The twins scampered to the couch, watching the adults with wide, curious eyes. David gestured to a battered kitchen chair. "Please sit." George complied, noting that David remained standing, as if needing the physical advantage. "So," David began, crossing his arms, "why does a millionaire like you care about Elizabeth?" George took a steadying breath. "David, what I'm about to tell you may be hard to believe, but I ask that you hear me out." For the next several minutes, George recounted his story with Elizabeth. The diner's beginnings, their love, the argument that drove them apart. David listened in stunned silence, his expression shifting from shock to anger to disbelief. "You're telling me," David finally said, his voice trembling, "that you're Susan's father, my daughter's grandfather?" George nodded solemnly. "I didn't know, not until a few days ago. If I had known—" "If you had known what?" David cut him off, his voice rising. "You would have shown up, helped when Susan was dying, when I lost my job, when your granddaughters were starving?" The twins shrank back on the couch, frightened by their father's anger. George rose slowly, his hands held up in a peaceful gesture. "David, you have every right to be angry with me. I made terrible mistakes, mistakes that cost you and your family dearly. I can't change the past, but I'm here now. I want to help." David let out a bitter laugh. "Help? And how exactly do you plan to do that?" "For starters," George said calmly, "I can offer you a job at the American Dream Diner, a management position with a salary and benefits that will allow you and the girls a comfortable life. For a moment, David looked tempted, the lure of financial stability clear in his eyes. But then his face hardened again. "I don't need your charity." "It's not charity," George insisted. "It's an opportunity, a chance for a fresh start to give your girls the future they deserve." At that, Lily hopped off the couch. "Dad, please. Could we have our own room, with real beds?" Daisy joined her sister, her eyes pleading. "And you wouldn't have to work so many hours. We could have dinner together every night." David looked at his daughters, his resolve wavering. George saw his opening. "David," he said gently, "I know I don't deserve your trust, but think of the girls. They deserve a chance, and so do you." A long silence filled the small apartment. Then, slowly, David's shoulders slumped. I need time to think," he mumbled. George nodded. "Of course, take all the time you need." He placed a business card on the table. "My personal number is there. When you're ready, call me. Day or night." As he was about to leave, George felt a tug on his sleeve. It was Daisy. "Sir," she said timidly, "did you really know our grandma?" George knelt to meet her gaze. "Yes, sweetheart. Your grandma was the most amazing person I've ever known." Lily joined her. "Will you tell us about her?" "Daddy doesn't say much." George glanced at David, who after a moment's hesitation gave a slight nod. "How about this?" George proposed, a kind smile on his face. "Next time we meet, I'll bring some old photos, and I'll tell you all about your grandma. Deal?" The twins nodded eagerly, their faces bright with anticipation. Standing up, George noticed a subtle shift in David's posture. The younger man was still wary, but a flicker of hope had ignited. "Mr. Miller," David said, walking him to the door. "I can't promise anything, but thanks for coming." George smiled gently. "Thank you for hearing me out, David. And please remember, you're not alone anymore. Not now." As the elevator descended, George felt a whirlwind of emotions. Sadness for the lost time, guilt for his past, but also a glimmer of hope. It was a beginning. Stepping out of the building, he glanced up at the fifth-floor window. For a brief moment, he saw two small faces pressed against the glass, waving shyly. George waved back, a genuine smile spreading across his face. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in decades, he felt he was on the right path. With determined steps, he walked towards his car, his mind already mapping out the next moves. There were so many wrongs to right, but with Elizabeth as his guide and Lily and Daisy's future as his motivation, George knew he would do whatever it took to set things right. The journey to redemption had just begun. The conference room on the 30th floor of the Miller Enterprises building was thick with tension. Seated at the head of a long mahogany table, George Miller studied the executives before him. Some looked anxious, others curious, and a few, like Mark Thompson, looked openly skeptical. "Ladies and gentlemen," George began, his voice steady despite his 70 years, "I've called this meeting to discuss a significant change in our company's direction." He paused, letting the words sink in. "In the past few days, I've had the opportunity to revisit our roots. The first American Dream Diner, the heart of everything we've built. And what I saw? Well, it wasn't the legacy I intended to leave behind." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Miller, if this is about the incident with that employee." George raised a hand, silencing him. "It's about much more than one incident, Mark. It's about who we are as a company and as a community." He pressed a button, and a presentation lit up the screen behind him, showing images of the original diner, photos of smiling customers, and happy staff from across the decades. "When I started this business," George continued, his voice colored with emotion, "it wasn't just about selling burgers and milkshakes. It was about creating a home away from home for our community, a place where everyone was welcome, where no one went hungry." He looked around the table, meeting each executive's eyes. "Somewhere along the way, we lost that vision. We became just another big corporation, prioritizing profit over people." Mark cleared his throat. With all due respect, Mr. Miller, those profits built an empire. We have shareholders to satisfy, targets to meet. George nodded. I understand your concern, Mark. But what if I told you we can do both? Be financially successful and socially responsible. He pressed another button, revealing new slides with graphs, financial projections, and detailed plans. I propose a new program. American Opportunities. We'll hire local unemployed folks, provide training and career development. We'll turn our diners into community hubs, offering after-school programs for kids, literacy classes for adults, and more. The room filled with murmurs. Some executives looked intrigued, others were clearly unconvinced. Mr. Miller, a marketing executive, spoke up. This sounds inspiring, but how can we ensure it won't hurt our bottom line? George smiled. Excellent question, Ms. Chen. Actually, studies show companies with strong social responsibility have better employee retention, greater customer loyalty, and, in the long run, stronger financial performance. For the next 20 minutes, he laid out his vision, answering questions and addressing concerns. He saw the resistance in many faces begin to soften, all except for Mark's. This is crazy, he finally burst out. We're throwing away decades of proven strategies because of what? A sudden crisis of conscience? The room fell silent. George regarded Mark calmly. No, Mark, we're returning to our roots. And as for you, perhaps it's time to reconsider whether your values align with the company's. Mark paled, understanding the implication. George turned back to the group. I don't expect everyone to agree right away, but I ask that you give this vision a chance. Let's start with a pilot program at the original diner. If it succeeds, we'll expand. After more discussion and a narrow vote, the plan was approved. George felt a surge of relief. The following week, he was back at the original diner. The place buzzed with activity. Painters refreshed the walls, electricians installed new lighting, and a design team rearranged the layout to include a community space. In the middle of it all was Emily, directing operations with newfound enthusiasm and efficiency. Emily, George called, and she turned with a bright smile. Mr. Miller, good to see you. We're making great progress here. George looked around, impressed. I can see that. How's the community reacting? Emily led him to a new bulletin board, already covered in colorful notes. See for yourself, she said, pointing to the messages. Can't wait for cooking classes. Finally, a safe place for my kids after school. Thank you for bringing hope back to our neighborhood. George felt a lump in his throat. This is incredible, Emily. You did all this in a week. Emily blushed. Well, I had a lot of help. The community really rallied. Oh, and there's something else I think you'll want to see. She led him to the back where a small crowd had gathered. To George's surprise, in the center were David and the twins. David, wearing an American Dream Diner uniform, was demonstrating how to use new kitchen equipment. Lily and Daisy, in tiny aprons, watched him with wide-eyed admiration. David accepted the job, Emily explained softly. He's heading our new training program for young people and the unemployed. George took in the scene, feeling a swell of pride. David glanced up and their eyes met. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement. The twins saw George and ran towards him. "Grandpa!" they cried in unison, wrapping their arms around his legs. George froze for a second, then knelt to hug them properly. "Hello, my dears," he said softly. "Are you enjoying the new diner?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "It's awesome. Dad says we can come here after school to do homework." "And play," Daisy added. "And he smiles a lot more now. He's not always sad anymore." George's heart filled. Glancing over the girls' heads, he saw David watching, a slight smile on his face. Emily, who had been observing quietly, touched George's shoulder. "Mr. Miller, I think we have something special happening here." George stood, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes, Emily, I believe we do." As they walked back to the front, George noticed people gathered outside, pointing and smiling. "Looks like word got out fast," Emily commented. George grinned. You know, Emily, when I started this business, I dreamed of creating more than just a diner, a place that was the heart of the community. He paused, taking in the freshly painted walls and smiling faces. I think we're finally on the right track. Emily smiled, placing a comforting hand on his arm. Better late than never, Mr. Miller. George chuckled softly. Yes, my dear, better late than never. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow through the diner's windows, George felt a peace he hadn't experienced in decades. The American Dream Diner was returning to its roots, and in doing so, he was rediscovering his own purpose. The road ahead was still challenging, but with Emily, David, the twins, and the entire community by his side, George knew they were on the right path. The true American Dream Diner, a beacon of hope, community, and compassion, was being reborn. And this time, he would get it right. The sun had barely risen when David arrived at the American Dream Diner, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his new uniform. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The smell of coffee and warm bread, along with Emily's welcoming smile, greeted him. Good morning, David. Ready for your first day? He nodded, trying to hide his nerves. I think so. The girls could hardly sleep. They were so excited. Emily laughed, leading him into the kitchen. They're not the only ones. Come on, let me introduce you to the team. As Emily made the introductions, David noticed the curious glances. Clearly, his story had spread. Joe, the head cook, offered a warm handshake. Welcome aboard, David. I hear you've got some kitchen experience. A bit, David admitted. I worked in a few restaurants before everything happened. Joe nodded sympathetically. Well, we're happy to have you. Let's start with the basics and build up, okay? Throughout the morning, David worked hard. His hands, once skilled, felt clumsy after so long away from a professional kitchen. During the lunch rush, he overheard two younger employees whispering. That's him, right? The guy Mr. Miller hired out of pity. I heard he was practically homeless. Can you imagine what customers will think? David's stomach dropped. Maybe this was a mistake. But then, as if sensing his unease, Emily appeared at his side. Hey, how's it going? She asked quietly. David shrugged. I think I'm slowing everyone down. Emily offered an encouraging smile. It's your first day, David. No one expects perfection. The important thing is you're here, trying. That's more than most would do. Her words lifted some of the weight from his shoulders. With a grateful nod, he got back to work. Meanwhile, at the corporate office, George faced his own challenges. Reports and alarmed emails piled up on his desk. Mr. Miller, his assistant, said, the finance department is requesting an urgent meeting. They're worried about the costs of the American Opportunities program. George sighed, massaging his temples. Schedule it for tomorrow. And could you call Mark in? We need to have a talk. Moments later, Mark entered, his posture tense. Sir, you wanted to see me? George motioned for him to sit. Mark, I've received reports that you've been less than cooperative with our new initiatives. Mark shifted. Mr. Miller, with all respect, these changes are risky. We're throwing away years of proven strategies for what amounts to a charity project. George studied him. Mark, do you remember why you got into this business? The question caught Mark off guard. For success, of course, to build something meaningful. And what's more meaningful than changing lives? George asked softly. Than giving hope to a community? Mark fell silent, waging an internal battle. George continued, I'm not asking you to agree with everything overnight, but I'm asking you to give it a chance. Go to the diner, see for yourself what we're building. After a long pause, Mark nodded slowly. I shall try, sir. Back at the diner, the day was ending. David, exhausted but satisfied, was wiping down the counter when he heard familiar voices. Daddy! Lily and Daisy bounded in, their faces glowing. Behind them, Lisa entered with a tired smile. Hey, princesses, David said, crouching to hug them. How was school? Great, Lily replied. My teacher said my reading has gotten a lot better. And I made a new friend today, Daisy added. He's going to come here tomorrow for the after-school program. David's heart swelled with pride. In just a few weeks, the change in his daughters was remarkable. Emily joined them, smiling. "Hey, girls, how about a special milkshake to celebrate your dad's first official day?" While the twins cheered, Lisa pulled David aside. "How was it?" she asked gently. David hesitated. "Hard," he admitted, "but good, better than I expected." Lisa squeezed his arm reassuringly. "I'm proud of you, David. I know it wasn't easy accepting help, but look how much has changed already." He nodded, watching his daughters giggle with Emily. "Yeah, I think we made the right choice." As the weeks turned into a month, small victories accumulated. The after-school program gained popularity, and David, overcoming his initial nervousness, became a mentor to other trainees, his story of struggle inspiring many. One day, during George's weekly visit, he noticed a new photo display on the diner wall. "What's this?" he asked Emily. She smiled, guiding him closer. "It's our wall of transformations." Each photo tells the story of someone whose life was touched by American opportunities. George examined the pictures, recognizing faces he'd once seen on the street, now smiling in diner uniforms. At the center, one photo caught his eye. David, Lily, and Daisy, all beaming, with the diner in the background. "Incredible," George murmured. At that moment, the front door opened, and to everyone's surprise, Mark walked in. He looked around, impressed by the changes. His gaze landed on the photo wall, and for an instant, George saw something shift in his expression. "Mr. Miller," Mark said, approaching. I think I understand now." George smiled, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. "Welcome back to the true spirit of the American Dream Diner, Mark." As the sun set, casting a golden glow through the windows, George felt a surge of pride. The challenges were still many, but looking around at Emily leading with grace, David finding his place, the twins flourishing, and even Mark beginning to come around, he knew they were on the right path. The American Dream Diner wasn't just a business, it was a beacon of hope, a catalyst for change, and a home. And with each small victory, they were rewriting not just a company's story, but an entire community's. George smiled to himself. Elizabeth would be proud. The morning sun bathed the newly refurbished, the American Dream Diner, in a golden glow, as though blessing the changes made in recent months. George Miller, now 71, paused outside to take in the sight. 6 months had passed since the scandal that nearly destroyed everything, and at last a new day had dawned. Stepping inside, he was greeted by the lively buzz of conversation and laughter. In one corner, a group of seniors played chess. In another, students pored over books in the after-school tutoring program. The scent of fresh coffee and baked bread filled the air, mingling with the unmistakable aroma of hope and renewal. Emily spotted him and walked over with a radiant smile. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. All ready for the big announcement?" George nodded, his eyes filled with pride and nostalgia. As he made his way through the diner, he couldn't help reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The decision to be utterly transparent during the crisis, though risky, had proven to be the diner's salvation. The community, touched by their honesty and resolve, had come together in unexpected ways. Near the community wall, now expanded to cover an entire side, George stopped to read a recent newspaper clipping. Ex-American Dream executive convicted of fraud. The accompanying photo showed Mark being escorted out of the courthouse. George felt a pang of sadness, but also the satisfaction that justice had been served. David, now general manager, approached with a smile. "They're all set in the conference room, Mr. Miller." Moments later, George found himself in front of a small crowd, employees, board members, and community representatives. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Good morning, everyone. Today marks not just a new chapter for the American Dream Diner, but the close of an era. After much thought, I've decided it's time for me to retire. A ripple of surprise passed through the room, but George raised his hand for silence. "Don't worry. The American Dream Diner is in excellent hands. It is with great pride that I announce our new leadership structure, Emily Peterson as CEO and David Miller as COO." The room erupted in enthusiastic applause as Emily and David stepped up, looking equally stunned and grateful. "These two," George continued, "embody everything the American Dream Diner stands for: compassion, integrity, resilience. Under their leadership, I know our mission to feed not just bodies, but souls, will continue to flourish." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "These past months have tested us in unimaginable ways. We faced our greatest crisis and emerged not just survivors, but transformed. And that, my friends, is thanks to each and every one of you." From his pocket, he took out an old photograph, the same one showing a young Elizabeth and a dark-haired George in front of the original diner. "This is Elizabeth, the true founder of the American Dream Diner in spirit. She taught me that the real measure of success isn't profit, but the lives we touch." The room fell into a respectful hush, many eyes glistening. Just then, the doors opened, and Lily and Daisy walked in, carrying a large cake decorated with the new diner logo. "Surprise, Grandpa?" they cheered in unison. George laughed, his heart overflowing with love. The twins, now healthy and radiant, were living proof of the transformation they'd all undergone. The celebration that followed was filled with laughter, shared stories, and promises for the future. George circulated among the guests, savoring every moment. By late afternoon, he found himself outside, watching the sun set in a wash of gold. Emily joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "A penny for your thoughts," she said softly. George smiled, just thinking about the power of small acts of kindness. "You know, all this began with one compassionate waitress feeding two hungry girls." Emily blushed slightly. Who would have thought that moment would change so many lives? That's how real change happens, George reflected. Not through grand gestures, but through small acts of love and compassion, one at a time. They stood in companionable silence, watching people come and go from the diner. "You've built something amazing here, Mr. Miller," Emily finally said. "Something that will outlive all of us." George shook his head. "We built it, Emily. All of us. And that's why I know it's in good hands." As the sky turned pink and gold, George felt a profound sense of peace. The American Dream Diner wasn't just a diner. It was a testament to the power of love and community. He thought of Elizabeth, of Susan, of everyone who had been part of this journey, and he knew they would be proud. As the diner lights flicked on, casting a welcoming glow, George smiled. A new chapter was beginning, and while his active role was ending, he knew the real work of nurturing souls and spreading kindness would carry on one plate at a time. Because in the end, that was what truly mattered. As George looked at the vibrant scene before him, the busy diner, the united community, the legacy of love grown from a simple dream, he knew he had fulfilled the promise he made to Elizabeth all those years ago. The American Dream Diner was truly the heart of a community, and its warmth would continue to shine, feeding bodies and nourishing souls for generations to come. That night, back home, George prepared for bed and picked up the old photo of Elizabeth from his bedside table. "Oh, Elizabeth," he murmured, tracing her face with his finger. "I hope I'm doing the right thing. I hope I'm honoring your legacy." And for a brief instant, perhaps just his imagination, George could have sworn he saw Elizabeth smiling back at him, her eyes brimming with pride and love. With that image in mind, he drifted off to sleep, comforted by the knowledge that no matter what the next day brought, he would face it with the strength and integrity Elizabeth had always seen in him. Her legacy would live on, not just within the walls of the American Dream Diner, but in the hearts and actions of everyone she had touched. And George was determined to ensure that legacy remained intact, no matter the cost. George's office was silent, the tension palpable in the air. Mark Thompson sat rigidly in a chair across the desk, his gaze shifting between defiance and anxiety. George, for his part, appeared calm, though his heart raced. "Mark," George began, his voice firm, "we discovered something during our recent audit, something that deeply disturbed me." Mark shifted uneasily. "What are you talking about, Mr. Miller?" George slid a folder across the desk. "See for yourself." With trembling hands, Mark opened the folder. His eyes went wide as he flipped through pages of charts, figures, and irrefutable evidence of his fraud. I can explain," he stammered. "Please do," George replied, his tone icy. Mark began mumbling excuses, financial pressures, personal problems, anything to justify his actions. But as he spoke, his voice changed. The defensiveness gave way to something more sinister. "You know, Mr. Miller," Mark said, straightening in his chair, "I'm not the only one with secrets." George frowned. "What do you mean?" Mark offered a malicious smile. "Elizabeth Miller, your secret affair, the daughter you abandoned. I'm sure the shareholders would be fascinated by that story." George's blood ran cold. How did he know? Realizing his advantage, Mark continued, "What about a deal? You overlook my discrepancies, and I keep your story under wraps. Everyone wins." For a moment, George was tempted. It was an easy out. He could avoid scandal, protect the company's reputation. But then Elizabeth's voice echoed in his mind. "Our integrity is what makes us special, George." George rose slowly, his determination renewed. "No, Mark, there will be no deal. What you did was wrong, and there will be consequences." The door flew open, and Emily entered, followed by 2 security guards. "Mr. Miller, everything okay here?" George nodded. "Yes, Emily. Please escort Mr. Thompson out. His services are no longer required at the American Dream Diner." As Mark was led away, shouting threats, George sank into his chair. The storm was just beginning. In the hours that followed, George's office turned into a crisis center. Emily, David, and other loyal team members gathered, working feverishly to assess the damage and devise a plan. "The total diverted funds amount to nearly $2 million over the years," Emily reported, her voice tense. "This could seriously jeopardize our community programs." David, now a key player on the team, added, "And employees are starting to ask questions. Rumors are spreading." As if to prove his point, George's phone rang. It was his press officer. "Mr. Miller, we have a problem." The local media got hold of the story. They're asking for a comment on allegations of fraud at the American Dream Diner. George closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. But when he opened them again, a fierce resolve burned within. "Call a press conference," he instructed, "and gather all the employees. It's time for complete transparency." Emily eyed him with concern. "Are you sure? We could try to control the narrative, minimize the damage?" George shook his head. "No. Elizabeth always said the truth, however painful, is the only path. We face this head on." 2 hours later, the main dining area of the American Dream Diner was packed. Anxious employees, hungry journalists, and worried community members crowded in, awaiting answers. George took a makeshift stage under the glare of camera flashes. He drew a deep breath, finding courage in the memory of Elizabeth and the silent support of Emily and David at his side. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I'm here today to address allegations of fraud within the American Dream Diner. It is with deep regret that I confirm these allegations are true." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. George raised his hand for silence. "A senior executive diverted significant funds over the years. This individual has been terminated, and we are cooperating fully with the authorities." He paused, looking directly at the worried faces of his employees. "I know many of you are concerned about your jobs, about the diner's future. Let me assure you, we will do everything in our power to fix this. No one will lose their job because of this wrongdoing." George then turned to address the community members. "To our community, which has trusted and supported us, I apologize. We failed in our oversight, but I promise you, we will be better, more transparent, more accountable. The programs we've started will continue." The heart of the American Dream Diner, the spirit of compassion and community service, remains intact. As George continued outlining plans for stricter audits, a compensation fund for affected programs, and a renewed commitment to ethical business, something remarkable happened. The room's initial shock and anger began to shift into something else: hope. Employees exchanged determined glances, community members nodded in support, and even some reporters seemed impressed by his honesty and plan of action. After the conference, as the team gathered to discuss next steps, David approached George. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know, we're with you, all of us. What you've built, what it means to people like me and my daughters, it's worth fighting for." George felt tears prick his eyes. "Thank you, David. That means more than you can imagine." Emily joined them, her eyes shining with resolve. "So, what's the plan?" In the weeks that followed, the American Dream Diner faced its toughest challenge. The media was relentless, shareholders were furious, and for a while it seemed everything they'd worked for might collapse. But then, something incredible happened. The community rallied. Former beneficiaries of the diner's programs came forward to defend the company. Employees worked extra hours without complaint. Even competitors offered support, recognizing the good the diner had done. George led the charge, working tirelessly to recover diverted funds, restructure the company, and rebuild public trust. He sold personal assets, slashed his own salary, and became the face of transparency and accountability. There were moments of doubt, nights when the burden felt overwhelming. But whenever George thought about giving up, he'd glance at Elizabeth's photo on his desk, or see Lily and Daisy playing in the diner, or witness Emily and David's unwavering dedication, and he would find the strength to go on. Slowly but surely, things started to improve. The community programs not only survived, but expanded, fueled by an outpouring of donations and volunteers inspired by the diner's resilience. One evening, months after the initial revelation, George stood alone in the diner after closing, surveying the walls now adorned with supportive messages from the community. He felt a surge of emotion wash over him. "We did it, Elizabeth," he whispered to the empty air. "It wasn't easy, but we did it." And though the road ahead remained long, George knew that with the truth as their guide and Elizabeth's spirit as their inspiration, the American Dream Diner would not just survive, it would thrive. The storm had passed, and the dawn of a new day was on the horizon. The rising sun lit up the newly restored facade of the American Dream Diner, its sign gleaming like a promise fulfilled. George Miller, at 71, stood for a moment, admiring the view. 6 months had passed since the scandal nearly destroyed everything, but now, at last, a new day had arrived. Stepping inside, George was greeted by a lively hum. People from all walks of life shared tables and smiles. Emily, now Director of Community Operations, greeted him with a warm hug. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. Ready for the big announcement?" George nodded, pride and nostalgia shining in his eyes. As he walked through the diner, he couldn't help recalling the journey that had led them here. Their decision to be completely transparent during the crisis, risky though it was, had saved the American Dream Diner. The community, moved by the honesty and determination to right the wrongs, had come together in ways no one expected. Near the community bulletin board, now expanded to an entire wall, George paused to read a recent headline: "Ex-American Dream Executive Convicted of Fraud." The photo showed Mark being escorted out of court. George felt a twinge of sadness, but also the satisfaction of seeing justice served. David, now general manager, walked up with a grin. "Everything's set up in the conference room, Mr. Miller." Minutes later, George stood before a small crowd of employees, board members, and community leaders. Taking a deep breath, he began his speech. Good morning, everyone. Today doesn't just mark a new chapter for the American Dream Diner, it also signifies the end of an era. After much reflection, I've decided it's time for me to retire. A wave of surprise rippled through the attendees, but George raised his hand for calm. Don't worry, the American Dream Diner is in very capable hands. It is with immense pride that I announce our new leadership team, Emily Peterson as CEO and David Miller as COO. A thunderous round of applause followed as Emily and David joined George at the front, both looking stunned and deeply moved. These two, George continued, exemplify everything the American Dream Diner stands for: compassion, integrity, and resilience. I know that under their leadership, our mission to feed not just bodies, but souls, will continue to thrive. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. The last few months have tested us in unimaginable ways. We faced our greatest crisis and emerged stronger, not because of me, but because of all of you. George pulled out an old photo. Elizabeth, young and radiant, standing beside a younger version of himself before the very first diner. This is Elizabeth, the real founder of the American Dream Diner in Spirit. She taught me that true success isn't in the profits we earn, but in the lives we touch. A respectful hush fell over the room, many eyes brimming with tears. At that moment, the doors swung open, and Lily and Daisy entered, carrying a large cake adorned with the diner's updated logo. "Surprise, Grandpa!" they shouted together. George laughed, his heart overflowing. The twins, now beaming with health and happiness, were living proof of how far they'd all come. The celebration that followed was filled with laughter, shared memories, and renewed commitments. George moved among the crowd, cherishing every moment, every face, every embrace. Late in the afternoon, he found himself standing outside, watching the golden sunset. Emily joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts," she said softly. George smiled, just marveling at how much can change from small acts of kindness. You know, this all started with one compassionate waitress feeding two hungry girls. Emily blushed a bit. Who would have guessed that single moment would transform so many lives? That's how real change happens, George reflected. Small acts of love, one by one. They stood quietly, watching people come and go, families sharing dinners, volunteers arriving for evening service, students gathering for study sessions. "You've created something extraordinary here, Mr. Miller," Emily said at last. "Something that will endure long after we're gone." George shook his head. "We created it, Emily. All of us. And that's how I know it's going to be okay." As the sky streaked pink and gold, George felt a profound sense of peace. The American Dream Diner wasn't just a diner or even a business. It was a testament to the power of compassion, community, and love. He thought of Elizabeth, of Susan, of all those who had been part of this story, and he knew deep in his soul that they would be proud. As the diner's lights flicked on, bathing the street in a warm glow, George smiled. A new chapter was beginning, not just for the American Dream Diner, but for the entire community. And though his active role was ending, George understood that the real work, the work of feeding souls, spreading kindness, building connections, would go on, one plate at a time, one smile at a time, one act of compassion at a time. For in the end, that was what truly mattered. Not the profits or accolades, but the bonds forged, the lives touched, the souls nourished. And as George beheld the vibrant scene before him, a bustling diner, a united community, a legacy of love grown from a simple dream, he knew he had fulfilled the promise he once made to Elizabeth. The American Dream Diner truly was the heart of a community, and its warmth would continue to shine, feeding bodies and nurturing souls for generations to come.